Welcome to Review Podcast number 4 for AP European History and IB History Year 1. The title of this podcast is The Habsburgs and Their Subjects, 1356 through 1914. This is a pretty complex session, so I'm going to encourage you, if you're trying to keep along in a sort of timeline, to create a row for Germany, which will comprise both Austria and the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia, and then the German state. And then a sort of a row for Italy, and then a row for Spain, and then a row for the Netherlands, because we'll be covering sort of all of that territory during the course of this review session. And we're going to move largely chronologically, but that means that we'll have to pass back and forth between those large geographical areas, so it'll maybe help keep straight what is a very complicated story. I'm actually going to start in Germany, because in 1356, the Emperor Charles IV issued what was known as the Golden Bull, which declared that henceforth the German states would elect an emperor, or more correctly, the 7 largest, strongest, most influential German states would elect an emperor. Germany was highly fragmented because it was born out of the empire of Charlemagne, and when Charlemagne died, that empire was divided among his 3 sons. And the reason why it was divided among his 3 sons was that the Franks practiced partible inheritance, not primogeniture. And primogeniture, the oldest son inherits the entire empire or the entire holdings of his father. But in partible inheritance, the empire is divided up among the sons, and that was the case with Charlemagne. Well, and then it was the case for his sons and their sons. And so if you can imagine then that the territory of Germany, which had been conquered by Charlemagne and incorporated into his empire, was divided and redivided until it was extremely fragmented, with dozens of tiny little states, little miniature principalities, little statelets, and then a handful of larger, more powerful ones. This made them extremely vulnerable to invasion. They were disunited, and therefore they were weak. And so in 1356, it was proposed that they elect an emperor to keep them all on the same page. And that allowed the Holy Roman Empire to be stronger, and continue to be an influential player, the most influential player, arguably, in the center of Europe and in European politics for centuries. And because the Habsburg family, which originated out of what is today the area around Austria, kind of between Austria and Bohemia, Austria and the Czech Republic, because the Habsburg family was so often elected to the position of Holy Roman Emperor, they then were very influential as well. But having made this brief statement about Germany, I want to shift now to Italy, because Italy did not experience that sort of unifying and rationalizing process. Northern Italy was also a part of Charlemagne's empire. It had been conquered by Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, and incorporated into the empire of the Franks. It became part of Charlemagne's empire, and then, again, was part which was divided by one, received by one of his sons, and then divided and subdivided until it too was extremely fragmented. And those who possessed the sort of estates, the noble estates of northern Italy, were known as contadini. So these are the Italian nobles, and they were extremely contentious, always fighting against each other, typically over territory. And sometimes not even remembering what they were fighting over. The disputes, the vendettas, sort of blood feuds between families of contadini, which are sort of become the backdrop of a play like Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. The blood feuds were such that by the time you got a century or two down the road, people didn't even remember why they were fighting them. And so it was clear that the contadini were not going to make any sort of progress in unifying northern Italy. And so northern Italy was a sort of a violent basket case. There were those who, by the start of the 15th century, wanted to perhaps place northern Italy under the authority of somebody else. Some proposed that the Pope ought to be given the authority over northern Italy. He already ruled the Papal States in the center of Italy. Perhaps the Pope could bring order to northern Italy, order out of chaos. These people were known as Guelphs, Guelphs. And then on the other hand, there were those who looked to the north, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the example that had been established there, and said that northern Italy would be best off if it was ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor, and they proposed to place northern Italy under the authority of the emperor. These two groups, of course, disagreed with each other, and they began to fight each other, and so that didn't really bring order out of chaos in northern Italy either. So you had two groups of people who had different solutions to the problem, fighting each other, and then you had the people who were the problem, the contadini, fighting each other. The people who were the most put off by this were this emerging group of middle class, the merchants. Italy was so perfectly positioned to benefit from commerce, right there in the center of the Mediterranean, a lot of coastline, a lot of natural harbors, and certainly, particularly the city of Venice was well known as a center of commerce between Asia and the Middle East and then Western Europe. And the point is that this is this era when you're coming out of the medieval period and the economy is coming back to life, and trade between Asia and Europe is growing, and trade within Europe is growing. And so these merchants became increasingly influential. They became increasingly wealthy. Their capacity to generate income was sort of unlimited compared to that of the nobles, whose capacity to generate income was limited by the amount of land they owned. And these merchants sort of, they found themselves constantly harassed, and they found their trade constantly interrupted by the ongoing depredations and feuding of these nobles. And so the merchants began to band together. And wherever there was a center of trade, the merchants began to gather and sort of conspire with each other to try to carve out a space where trade could be carried on free of the interruption of these merchants, free of the interruption and the harassment. Free of the interruption and harassment of these nobles. And that's how the early northern Italian city-states of the early modern era began to be established. Merchants and bankers and guild masters were sort of banding together to declare a certain space off limits to the nobles, to sort of keep them out so that trade might go on uninterrupted. And so in places like Venice and Florence and Pisa and Genoa, these sorts of city-states were established, and the mutual pledge of assistance and the mutual pledge of support meant that these powerful people, the popolo grosso, as they were called, the big people, the important people, it meant that these people essentially governed the cities, and these cities took on the characteristic of republics, because the popolo grosso, although they had established the cities out of a pursuit of their own interests, at least claimed to govern the cities in the interests and for the benefit of the popolo minuto, the little people, the people of the city. And it is certainly true that the popolo minuto, the little people of the city, benefited from the stability and the prosperity that went with that stability and the security that the merchants and the bankers and the guild masters brought to those cities. So all of those early Italian city-states in northern Italy, they came to be republics. And not republics like we think of the American Republic. These were not democratic republics in which the leadership of the city was chosen by a vote of the people. They were republics in the sense that the leadership of the city, although essentially self-chosen, governed in the name of the people and, at least in theory, for the sake of the people and to the benefit of the people. The governing council, then, were sort of the lead, the elders of the lead families of the popolo grosso, and these were known as the signoria. And the signoria, they ruled as a sort of executive and legislative council. They ruled it was an oligarchy. It was government by the powerful, government by the wealthy, and in some cases, government by the extremely wealthy, where you might have one family who dominated the signoria. And that was the case famously in Florence, where the Medici family came to dominate the Signoria. The Medici, they actually originated their wealth in the wool trade, but it was Cosimo de' Medici who built the family's wealth in banking. His father Giovanni had conceived the idea of establishing a bank, and then Cosimo had picked up that idea and had built the Medici Bank into was probably the most powerful, influential bank in all of Europe, certainly in Italy, if not all of Europe. Ultimately, the bank, the Medici Bank, was inherited by Cosimo's two of his grandsons, Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici, who managed the bank during the middle years of the 15th century. Giuliano and Lorenzo were complementary people. Giuliano his talents were in accounting and numbers, whereas Lorenzo's talents were in negotiation and publicity and dealing with people. And so their complementary talents helped to grow the bank even more. And the Medici were largely beloved in Florence because they lent money to everybody. They didn't just lend money to the powerful, although they did lend money to the powerful, and that gave them additional influence. But they lent money even to common farmers in the hills, the Tuscan hills surrounding the city of Florence. And even when they could have really put the screws to their clients, to those whom they had loaned money, they tended not to. There was a year when there was a horrible harvest due to a drought, and although the Medici would have been fully within their rights to foreclose on people's land to get repayment for their loans, they didn't. They give an extra year for the farmers to come up with the money they need to pay their loans. And for this reason, they were respected and feared because of their power, their influence, but they were also beloved by the people of the city of Florence for the most part. They did, however, have really two major rivals. One major rival was actually an entire family, the Della Rovere family. The Della Rovere family was a family of contadini, nobles, who possessed territory to the east and the south of Florence. And the Della Rovere were always eyeing the territory in between their territory and the city-state of Florence for expansion. But on the other hand, the Medici and the government of Florence, which came to be one and the same, they were eyeing that territory for expansion for the sake of, because cities relied on the revenues and that they made from taxing income and land. And so by expanding into more land, first of all, they brought more agricultural land into the sway of Florence so they could feed a growing population. Additionally, they could generate more tax revenue. So the city-states were always sort of looking outward, trying to find ways to expand and generate more revenue. And on the other hand, the Della Rovere were looking at this land as well. And so there's a natural rivalry between the Della Rovere, a very powerful family of contadini, and then the Medici, who had come to take control of the Signoria in Florence. It was actually in the middle of the 15th century that the first Della Rovere pope came into power. This was Pope Sixtus IV. He was maybe famous for constructing the Sistine Chapel, ordering the construction of it, not the famous decoration of it, but rather the construction of it. And that's why it's called the Sistine. When you take the name Sixtus and you make it into an adjective, you get Sistine. So Sixtus IV ordered the construction of the Sistine Chapel. He was also a rival of the Medicis. The other major rival of the Medicis were the Pazzi family, and the Pazzi were a rival banking family who were operating a bank, and they were always a step behind the Medici. They could never quite catch up, and so they were looking to overcome the advantage that the Medici had. In 1478, the Pazzi conspired with Pope Sixtus IV, as it turns out, in an effort to murder Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici. Giuliano and Lorenzo knew they were sort of marked men and rarely appeared in public, but only a few times a year. And so the notion was that they would be stabbed to death by assassins on one of those few occasions. The Pazzi conspiracy did not go as planned. Giuliano was killed by one of the assassins. But then Lorenzo was not. Lorenzo survived. And as a matter of fact, Lorenzo, having survived, was able to mobilize the people of Florence to take a brutal revenge against the Pazzi family, for which he was excommunicated by Pope Sixtus IV, and the entire city of Florence was placed under interdict by Pope Sixtus IV. But it's interesting, this too backfired. As a matter of fact, rather than condemning Lorenzo and Florence, most people throughout Europe condemned the Pope for allowing his personal... It was clear, although at that time it was not known that he was in on this conspiracy, it was clear that he was using his spiritual powers to exert influence and punish his political rivals. And actually it was a source of discontent and criticism, and it was evidence that the church was becoming worldly and secular, and it was part of a long chain of the discussion that was now taking place about whether the church was not too worldly and too secular. But anyway, following his successful survival of the Pazzi conspiracy, Lorenzo essentially ruled Florence as a dictator, a benevolent dictator, and he comes to be known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he ruled Florence until 1492, during which time he helped to make Florence not only into a powerful city of trade and banking, but also one of the major artistic fountainheads of the Renaissance. And it is Lorenzo who will, for example, promote the career of Michelangelo Buonarroti and so many other artists whom he patronized. It was actually this issue that finally, in some ways, brought about the downfall of the Medici family. Lorenzo Medici died in 1492, and at around that time, an Augustinian monk named Augustinian or Dominican, one or the other, monk named Girolamo Savonarola had come to Florence, and he was extremely critical of the worldliness of the Medici court, and extremely critical of the growing worldliness of the people of the city of Florence. And he basically told them that they were going to be condemned and die and writhe in hellfire forever because they were so focused on worldly things. And he managed to turn the population of Florence even against the Medici. And when Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, his son Piero, who's known as Piero the Unfortunate, was actually driven from Florence by Savonarola and his followers. Now, the Medici will eventually make a comeback, and Savonarola himself would run into problems because, having critiqued the Medici and the city of Florence for their worldliness, he eventually turned his criticism against the Church and the Vatican, and that got him killed. And in time, that opened the door for the Medici to come back to Florence and rule Florence again. But as of the end of the 15th century, as we transition into the 16th century, that was the situation. The situation was a temporary theocracy in Florence led by Savonarola and his followers, followed by a gradual return of the Republic. And all across northern Italy, the situation began to reduce in its chaos as these republics, these city-states based on republics, gained power. But the real ferment now was shifting back toward Germany, and so I'm going to shift your attention back toward Germany and that row that if you're taking notes in a separate row here. Because I mentioned that criticism of the church that was becoming common for its worldliness, people who criticized Sixtus IV for using his spiritual powers to advance his political agenda and strike back at his political enemies, Savonarola, who was criticizing the church for its worldliness. That ferment was very strong in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire. There was a sense among many Germans that they were victims of the church, that the church was seeking to extract from them as much wealth as possible, and having extracted that wealth, was then transferring that wealth down to Italy for the support of an Italian institution, that the church was a gigantic parasitic institution. And so there was great interest on the part of popes to ensure that whoever was the Holy Roman Emperor would be an advocate for the church and control the German people in the name of the church. And at this time, the Holy Roman Emperor died, and there was an election, and the election was won by Charles Habsburg, who was known as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Now again, the Habsburg family originated out of Austria, and they had built their empire largely through marriage. They were very strategic about, the Habsburg men were very strategic about marrying women who had no brothers, so that when their fathers died, their children would inherit those lands. And so the Habsburg Empire by the 15th century, by the 16th century, spread all across the center of Europe, from Vienna across through what is today Hungary and up into the Czech Republic, and then south into even almost out to Bulgaria, and then into parts of Italy and Spain. They had married into the royal family of Spain. As a matter of fact, the Habsburg, Charles Habsburg, had married Joan the Mad, who was the other daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the older daughter. And in this way, Spain's possessions in North America and South America, primarily South America and the Caribbean, as well as Spain's possessions in the Netherlands, all came to be governed by Charles V. And Charles V was then also elected Holy Roman Emperor, with the influence of Pope Leo X, who was the Medici Pope then. So you go from a Della Rovere Pope to a Medici Pope, and he had the support of the Medici Pope. Having been elected, however, he immediately was confronted with a crisis, because Leo X had also authorized the expansion of the sale of indulgences. And the sale of indulgences was considered by the German people to be yet another effort by the church to extract wealth from them. And it was unpopular, and most famously it was unpopular with a man named Martin Luther. Because Martin Luther, who was a professor of what we'd call theology today at Wittenberg, wrote out his objections to the sale of indulgences, 95 objections, called the 95 Theses, and posted them on the door of the church at Wittenberg. And when the printing press allowed these 95 Theses to be spread all across Germany in less than a month's time, Luther became sort of a celebrity for his opposition to the church. It really was just the opposition to this particular practice of the church. But in time, as the church the church's response to all this was kind of slow, and it allowed Luther time to sort of sit and think and write. But over time, Luther increasingly rejected much more central doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, and more of the German people were sort of gathering to his side and in support of him, particularly among the peasants. The German peasants, who felt, maybe more than any other group of Germans, felt put upon by the church in its efforts to extract wealth from them. And so you get the publication of a series of pamphlets that feature a character named Karsthans, Pitchfork John, who represented the voice of the peasants in their support for Martin Luther, because they perceived that Luther's religious revolution, that is to say, he was pushing more and more on these central doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, but many of these peasants saw his rebellion as a way of liberating themselves from the church's political influence over them. Well, the church finally paid attention and placed Martin Luther on trial in what was known as the Diet of Worms. The church had tried to get Martin Luther to come to Rome and basically answer for his dissent. Luther refused to go. In this refusal, he was protected by Frederick the Wise, who was the Elector of Saxony. Frederick had actually, for a time, been a candidate for Holy Roman Emperor, and of course was rejected and defeated in favor of Charles V. But Frederick the Wise seems to have been very closely tuned to the will of his peasant population and the growing discontent of his peasant population with the church. And so when the church attempted to force Luther to come to Rome and essentially allow himself to be placed under the Inquisition, under the authority of the Inquisition, instead, Frederick protected him. Luther was his subject, and he protected Luther in Wartburg Castle. So finally, the Church appealed, Leo X appealed to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, to place Luther on trial himself, instead of sending him to Rome for the Inquisition, because certainly the emperor's authority was one that Frederick could not easily resist. So at the Diet of Worms, an imperial diet, a summoning of all the German princes, not just the 7 important electors, but all the German princes in an important meeting, all right? In an imperial diet, the Diet of Worms, Martin Luther was placed on trial for heresy. The prosecutor in this was a man named Johann Eck, and Eck found it very easy to demonstrate that Martin Luther was, at least in the eyes of the church, and by definition, within the context of the church, was in fact a heretic. In fact, Luther essentially committed acts of heresy right in front of everybody there at the trial. But Luther, again, defied the church. He defied the emperor. He refused to recant anything that he had written or said, and he turned his back and walked out on the authority of the emperor and the authority of the church. And with Frederick the Wise's protection, continued to write in dissent of church doctrines, and even began to translate the Bible into German so that Germans could read it. This was another appeal of Luther to the German people. He wrote in German. He did not write in Latin, although he could. He was educated, and I should say, in addition to writing in Latin, he wrote in German. Although Luther was not himself a German nationalist, his rebellion appealed to the nationalistic sentiment of the Germans to not be unduly influenced by an outside force like the Roman Catholic Church. And a society known as the Staupitz Society was a sort of an early German nationalist organization seeking to promote the qualities of German culture and the characteristics of German culture as opposed to Latin or Roman culture, which many Germans felt was being imposed upon them by the church. Well, anyway, what Luther didn't realize was that his revolution was about to get out of his hands. Because whereas he saw his revolution as a religious one, a spiritual one that would change the way people worshipped, as I mentioned, the peasants saw it as a justification and as an opportunity to rise up against the general political and social order of things in Germany. And so, shortly after Luther's victory, if you want to call it that, at the Diet of Worms, rebellion, a very sharp peasant rebellion broke out, which is known as the Peasants' War. Thomas Müntzer, M-U-N-T-Z-E-R, Thomas Müntzer, who was a follower of Luther, sort of takes the leadership role in this peasant war, exhorting the peasants to attack churches and attack monasteries and drag priests out and murder them in the streets and smash Catholic icons and things like that. And the nobles, too, become victims of the peasants here. Luther, for one, was shocked and horrified and outraged. He did not ever intend for his religious revolution, his spiritual revolution, to be transformed into a social, political revolution. In fact, he writes an essay entitled "Against the Murderous, Rapacious, Thieving Hordes of Peasants." And for this, he gained Müntzer's hatred. Müntzer wrote to him at one point, "I would like to smell your frying carcass." The reality was that the peasants were not adequately organized to really achieve the kind of overturning of the political and social order that they envisioned, or that Müntzer envisioned. And after a period of about 2.5 years, the nobles, the German nobles, managed to put aside whatever differences they might have over religious doctrine, although those differences were growing and about to erupt into a different kind of war. And they put down the peasant rebellion. The peasants were ultimately defeated after about 2.5 years of fighting. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Germans were killed. And Luther himself remained focused on the spiritual side of what he was doing. In time, the nobles, having eliminated the threat of the peasants, in time now, the nobles divided amongst themselves, because some nobles embraced Luther's teachings, including, by the way, Frederick the Wise. Although Frederick, it is thought, initially supported Luther primarily from a political standpoint. That is, to leverage power against Charles V and to earn the respect and support of his peasants. In time, Frederick came to embrace Luther's doctrines as well, as did many of the German princes across the northern tier of German states. And very quickly what happened was the German princes, the German nobles, divided themselves into two camps. The camp in support of Luther formed an alliance known as the League of Schmalkald, SCHMALKALD, the League of Schmalkald, or the Schmalkaldic League. And they then went to war against the German states that remained loyal to the emperor and to the church. And that war really lasted for about 30 years. Now, this is not the 30 Years' War. This is the War of the League of Schmalkald, a war between Luther's supporters among the German princes and the church and the emperor's supporters. And the war lasted longer. It outlasted Luther. Luther died while it was still going on. Finally, in 1555, after 30 years of fighting, Charles V negotiated a sort of compromise with the Lutheran princes. This is known as the Peace of Augsburg. And essentially what it allowed was that German princes would each be allowed to choose the method of worship or the doctrine of worship for their subjects. If you wanted to be Lutheran, you could be Lutheran. If you wanted to remain Catholic, you could remain Catholic. It was an acknowledgement, really, of both sides, that neither was going to persuade the other through violence or force to change their ways. The Lutherans were not going to persuade the Catholics to stop being Catholic. Catholics were not going to persuade Lutherans to stop being Lutheran. The only result of ongoing warfare would be more bloodshed and chaos and disruption of society and economy. So the Peace of Augsburg was sort of an agreement to disagree. We're going to stop fighting. We're going to draw a line down the middle and say, okay, you guys can be this way, we'll be that way. By this time, though, the Protestant Reformation that Luther had kicked off had produced a variety of alternatives and leaders who preached doctrines that were separate even from Luther's. And one of those was John Calvin, who down in Geneva, in Switzerland, which was at that time a part of Habsburg territory, he was producing a doctrine that not only held that the church was too worldly, and in doing so, and because of its worldliness, had become corrupt, but he also embraced the philosophy of predetermination, and he was attempting to build in Geneva a community of God's elect, those whom God had chosen in advance, predetermined to be blessed, to be saved, to be granted eternal life. And he created a legal structure, a series of laws, and a system of enforcement that basically removed anybody who disagreed with him. Anybody who didn't follow his laws was considered to have exposed themselves as not God's chosen, not among the elect, and so they were kicked out. As a result, Geneva was extremely orderly, seemingly very well-organized society, and many came to Geneva and left feeling like that this was a model and were converted to Calvinism. One of those was Guy de Brès, who was from the Netherlands, at a time when the Netherlands was part of Spain. It was part of the holdings of the Habsburg family as a result of their marriage into the royal family of Spain. And so you can shift now, if you're sort of going on different rows, you can shift down to your row about the Netherlands, and we're going to sort of bounce back and forth between the Netherlands and Spain for a while. So when Guy de Brès returned to the Netherlands, he attempted to transplant Calvinist doctrines there, and he gathered a group of followers and established a church known as the Dutch Reformed Church. Well, this was at a time when Spain, it was at a time when Spain continued to consider itself to be a standard bearer for Roman Catholicism. All the way back in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella had successfully united Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella of Castile, these were two powerful, and now we're talking about Spain for a second, these were two powerful kingdoms that Spain had been at a time when Spain was not a single nation state. The two powerful kingdoms were Aragon and Castile. Ferdinand and Isabella had married and had combined their forces and had sought to unite Spain by conquering the smaller, weaker Spanish kingdoms and forging them into one, and also by driving out the Muslims, or Moors, in what was known as the Reconquista. And, by the way, at the same time, Ferdinand and Isabella also, during the Reconquista, expelled all of Spain's Jewish population, which had been fairly considerable prior to that time, in order to make Spain a sort of purely Catholic nation. And so from that time, the leaders of Spain considered themselves to be the sort of standard bearers for Roman Catholicism. And when the Habsburgs took over Spain, they simply continued that. They simply took over that. They continued that view of themselves. And so Charles V, as I mentioned, Charles V married Joan the Mad of Castile, who was the other daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Catherine of Aragon was one of them. Joan was the other. And all of Spain's holdings came into the sway of the Habsburg family, including Spain's massive empire in the Americas. Well, when Charles V completed his negotiation of the Treaty of Augsburg, a year later he then abdicated the throne, and I don't know whether it was his preference, but at this time it was decided that his son, Philip II, would not inherit the entirety of his vast empire. Philip II, it was said, would inherit the portion of the empire that was Spanish. So Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, and the empire in the Americas. And then on the other hand, Ferdinand I, who was Charles's younger brother, he was elected as Holy Roman Emperor and then given the leadership of Habsburg territories in what is today Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on, sort of the Eastern European side. So with the abdication of Charles V in 1556, the Habsburg family was divided into two. The Spanish Habsburgs, who will be the descendants of Philip II, and they will rule Spain and the Spanish possessions in sort of Western Europe and the Americas. And then the Austrian Habsburgs, the descendants of Ferdinand I, who will rule the Habsburg possessions, their original possessions in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and then they're the ones who will typically be elected as Holy Roman Emperors. So speaking of the Spanish Habsburgs then, Philip II had inherited that dedication to the Roman Catholic Church from his father, from Charles V, and from the original Royal Catholic majesties of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. So the growing influence of a Calvinist Protestant church, the Dutch Reformed Church, in the Netherlands, which were Spanish territory, was a problem for him, and he rejected it. And so he instituted what became known, sort of famously, as the Spanish Inquisition, which was an effort to root out and eliminate heretics. I mean, because Catholics or Calvinists operating in the Netherlands were regarded as heretics, to root them out and eliminate them. Well, the Dutch people many of them were extremely opposed to this, and they rebelled against Philip II, and they rebelled against the institution of the Inquisition, and they rebelled against Spanish authority. And they formed what was known as the Union of Utrecht, which sought to separate the Netherlands from Spain. The leader of the Netherlands revolt was a man named William the Silent, and he was one of many Williams who were leaders coming out of the Netherlands. He was of what was called the House of Orange, so William of Orange, nicknamed William the Silent. Orange was a family, one of the noble families of the Netherlands, and they had converted to Protestantism, and he will be the leader of the resistance to Philip II. Now, before we get into any more of that, I want to focus again on Spain itself. So you can shift to that row if you're working that way. Philip II had inherited a united and a sort of ethnically pure Spain, and he inherited a very wealthy Spain because Spain's empire in the Americas was now being tapped for silver and for gold. And there were vast amounts of silver and gold being exported from the Americas and Spain's empire there to Spain, and it was the driving force behind a thriving economy. This was a century known in Spain as the Golden Century, the 16th century, 1500, 1600, the Siglo de Oro. And Philip II intended to use the wealth of Spain to turn Spain into a cultural center, the cultural center of Europe, as well as the Catholic standard bearers of Europe. So, for example, famously, he built a palace called El Escorial, and interestingly, incorporated into that palace was a monastery because it demonstrated his commitment to the expansion of the Roman Catholic faith. But he made El Escorial into sort of what, in time, Versailles would become, in France, a magnet for talent and a magnet for wealth. And he was bringing in the best writers and the best painters, El Greco, Miguel de Cervantes, and he was a patron of them. He was supporting them in their artistic endeavors, their literary endeavors, because he wanted Madrid and El Escorial. He wanted that to become sort of like the new Florence. So it was a time of great cultural flowering in Spain, a time of great wealth, prosperity, and a time of great commitment to the advancement of the Roman Catholic faith. And it seemed like the Dutch were screwing all that up with their rebellion. So Philip wouldn't have that. But they weren't the only ones screwing things up. The English, the emerging power of England, was making things hard for Spain as well. Queen Elizabeth of England, who was not Catholic, but was Protestant, Anglican, she had visions of disrupting the growth of Spanish power, particularly in the Americas. And she didn't exactly incite, but she definitely facilitated the activities of a group of pirates known as the Sea Dogs, who were English pirates who would raid Spanish galleons. And galleons are these big, slow-moving, lumbering cargo ships that were carrying gold and silver back from Spain's empire in the Americas back to Spain. And the Sea Dogs would attack and capture these ships and take them back to England with their treasure. And they would give Elizabeth a share of the treasure, and for that reason Elizabeth was allowing them safe haven. And I think in general she sought to sort of stick it to Philip II. The other thing that she did then that outraged Philip II was she sent first English wealth and then English soldiers in support of the Dutch in their revolt. And that act was the one that made Philip so outraged that he was determined to get rid of her. And he conspired with Mary, Queen of the Scots, who was herself Roman Catholic and had been unseated as Queen of Scotland by her Presbyterian Calvinist nobles. He conspired with Mary, Queen of Scots, to essentially install Mary as the new Queen of England. What would this take? It would take an invasion of England. And Philip was building an armada, a giant fleet of warships and troop transport ships, to land an army in southern England. They were expected to brush aside the pitiful British fleet, which numbered probably less than 1/4 of the armada that he was building. Land in southern England. They were expected to brush aside Spanish troops who had been fighting in the Netherlands, so they were battle-tested. Were expected to brush aside the English. They could easily unseat Queen Elizabeth and install Mary, Queen of Scots. It didn't go that way. First of all, the Armada suffered a raid at the hands of Sir Francis Drake, one of the Sea Dogs. He destroyed much of the Armada while it was still under construction. Philip II, impatient and full of rage, decided to convert many of his galleons over so that he could have a quick turnaround. In the meantime, Mary, Queen of Scots, was captured and executed by the English. And in 1588, when the Armada was finally able to sail, it was defeated by the English, a smaller English fleet, in the English Channel. Defeated because the The English ships, although smaller and with guns that fired on a shorter range, they were more maneuverable. And in an era when, in order to aim your guns, you had to turn an entire ship, the smaller English ships were literally, in some cases, sailing circles around the Spanish ships and destroying them. There was also the Protestant wind, so that when Spain's ships attempted to escape through the North Sea, they are not able to take refuge in Scottish ports. There are navigational errors. Many Spanish ships attempting to return to Spain run aground on the coast of Ireland. The whole thing, the whole event of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a great disaster for Spain. And they didn't know it maybe at that moment, but it marked a turning point. And Spain, which had made itself one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful countries in Europe, starting in 1588 would experience a long, slow, steady decline over the next 300 years, in which they would ultimately lose all of their possessions in the Americas and find themselves a sort of very backward nation compared to many of the other countries of Western Europe. But for the moment, the Netherlands still remained under the control of Spain. In the meantime, now going back to Germany, at the start of the 17th century, so early 1600s now, Ferdinand Habsburg II was now the Holy Roman Emperor. And he, looking back on the decision of his ancestor, Charles V, at the Peace of Augsburg, to allow Germany's princes to decide for themselves whether they'd be Lutheran or Catholic, he looked back on that decision as a very regrettable decision, and one that he hoped that he could reverse. He was committed, as were all the other Habsburg leaders, to Roman Catholicism, and in particular to restoring Roman Catholicism as the dominant faith throughout the Holy Roman Empire. How would he convert the Lutherans of northern Germany? Well, probably be by force. The question is when and how. In 1618, he learned that the Bohemian princes were considering flipping, because initially Bohemia had been Roman Catholic. They had remained with the Roman Catholic Church following the Peace of Augsburg. But in 1618, the Bohemians indicated the potential that they might flip to Lutheran. Well, this was the exact opposite direction that Ferdinand II wanted to go. And so he sent ambassadors to Bohemia, to Prague, the capital there, to essentially attempt to negotiate a settlement that would keep Bohemia Roman Catholic. But the imperial ambassadors were met with a very hostile response, in which they were defenestrated. This is known as the defenestration of Prague. To defenestrate someone means to chuck them out of the window. And the imperial ambassadors were thrown out the 6-story window of Prague Castle. Now, they didn't die. They were thrown into a giant heap of dung that had been placed there preemptively just for this reason. But that event, the Bohemian Revolt, marked the start of what was known as the defenestration of Prague marked the start of what was known as the Bohemian Revolt. And although no one knew it at that time, also the start of a war known as the 30 Years' War. The Bohemians, I think, hoped that they would have widespread support among the Lutheran princes of northern Germany. And they did gain some Lutheran allies, though some of the most important Lutheran states of northern Germany, like Saxony, like Brandenburg, did not join them at this time. And that was bad news for them, because on the other hand, Ferdinand II was able to call upon his cousins over in Spain, the Spanish Habsburgs, and they sent an army of 10,000, 15,000 conquistadors, Spanish mercenaries essentially, to assist in the suppression of the Bohemians. The other problem that the Bohemians had was that leading the imperial forces was a very capable commander named Albert von Wallenstein, Albert von Wallenstein, Wallenstein. And in command of the imperial forces, he engaged the Bohemians and their small number of Lutheran allies at the Battle of White Mountain and crushed them. and the leaders of the Bohemian Revolt were captured and executed in public, and the Bohemian Revolt was therefore crushed. And had Ferdinand II been satisfied with the results that he had achieved, the 30 Years' War might not have happened. But in light of his overall goal, which was to restore the supremacy of Roman Catholicism throughout his empire, it seemed like now was the time, and this army and this commander was the how. Remember we said he didn't know when or how. It seemed like the when was now, and the army and Albert von Wallenstein was how. And so, not content to just rest on the victory against the Bohemians, Ferdinand directed his imperial forces under von Wallenstein to march northward and to essentially take retribution on the Lutheran princes who had supported the Bohemians, and to convert them by force to Roman Catholicism. And at this point, the Lutherans were now on the run. They were extremely disunited, and in the face of a very strong, powerful army and a very smart commander, they were being defeated. This alarmed King Christian IV of Denmark. Denmark was a Lutheran country, a Lutheran kingdom, who in 1623 concluded that if Ferdinand and the forces of the Habsburg Empire had such an easy time of crushing their own Lutheran princes and restoring them to Roman Catholicism, it was only a matter of time before they might choose to then come after other kingdoms that were Lutheran and try to eliminate Lutheranism throughout Europe. And Christian IV reasoned that it was better to intervene in the war now, when he would have some Lutheran German allies, than wait till they were all defeated and then have to fight the forces of Habsburg Austria on his own. So at this time, Denmark came into the war against the forces of the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, Ferdinand II. It didn't go well for them. The Danish forces were also crushed along with the other Lutherans. And at this point, Ferdinand II called upon Richelieu and Louis XIII of France, because really there were three very strong, powerful Roman Catholic countries in Europe: Habsburg Austria, Habsburg Spain, who were already engaged in this war, and then France. And what Ferdinand was hoping was that with the support of Habsburg, or with the support of France, they could finish off the Lutherans once and for all, and get this war done and essentially eliminate Lutheranism in Europe. Although Sweden was also Lutheran, and maybe they didn't have an answer for that yet, but basically. But, it was at this time that Richelieu advised Louis XIII not to get involved. Louis and Richelieu were busy eliminating the last of the Huguenot walled cities. The siege of La Rochelle was going on at this time. And perhaps, too, in light of Richelieu and Louis XIII's commitment to make France into the strongest, most powerful state in Europe, perhaps they didn't want the Habsburgs' war against the Lutherans to end so quickly. Perhaps they preferred to see the Habsburgs drag this war out and end up, come out of it weaker than when they went in, so that France would have an easier time shoving the Habsburgs aside to become the strongest state in Europe. This would be an example of the practice of raison d'etat, the rationality of the state, which held, the idea goes back at least to Machiavelli's writings, and the idea held that the interests of the state must dictate your foreign policy decisions, not loyalty to some creed or some church or some set of moral or ethical principles. And so Richelieu, although a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, was ruthless in his willingness to, in this case, stand by and watch his fellow Roman Catholics, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs, bleed while they were fighting the Lutherans, perhaps hoping that they would bleed just enough that then France could move in and take over as the strongest state. Well, at the time it wasn't a necessity that France enter the war, but soon it was about to become more so, because increasingly the Habsburgs, Ferdinand II specifically, began to doubt the loyalty of Albert von Wallenstein. He was extremely popular with his soldiers. And on the other hand, the war was dragging on, and And some people began to fear that von Wallenstein perhaps had his eye on seizing control of the government. And there's some evidence that he might have been interested in doing that. And so von Wallenstein was sacked, removed from power. And that was a very bad move because he was so popular with his troops that many of them simply abandoned the army and went AWOL. And the Habsburg army, which is so strong, sort of began to dwindle in size. The other thing that happened at this time was that Gustav Adolf, who was the king of Sweden, which was the other major Lutheran kingdom in Scandinavia, he brought Sweden into the war on the side of the Lutherans. This was bad news. Gustav Adolf brought an army of 35,000 men, and it was probably the most modern army in Europe at that time. Gustav Adolf had developed a way of taking those big lumbering cannon, which at the end of the 100 Years' War couldn't do much. They had to be cast in place and were only good for blasting away at castle walls. And he had reduced them in size and reduced the size of the solid shot shell that they were firing, and in that way was able to reduce the charge of powder, and that made them more mobile. They put them on wheels, and he brought them forth in battle in support of his infantry. So this is what was called field artillery. And so when the Swedish armies went into battle, they had field artillery in close support of their infantry, and then of course they had their cavalry to harass and chase after and create so panic among an army that was in the process of being defeated. And so this is a very modern army. Gustav Adolf's Swedish army also many of them carried firearms. And the army was led in battle personally by Gustav Adolf, who was known as the Lion of the North for his personal courage. And when Gustav Adolf brought Sweden into the war, some of the other Lutheran states that had been staying out so far, like Saxony, like Brandenburg, big important states with sizable armies, they now joined the war on the side of the Lutherans. They had been sort of staying out, stay neutral, but now they were in. And so at a time when the Habsburg army was shrinking, the numbers and the quality of the forces arrayed against them was growing. And victories by the Lutherans turned the tide of the war against the Habsburgs. And so in 1635, Ferdinand II had to again appeal to the French. This time now, he was seeking their help from a much more desperate position. Prior to this time, when he first sought Richelieu and Louis XIII's help, it would be to kind of give the final push to finish off the Lutherans. Now, the Lutherans had turned the tide of the war, and it looked like the Habsburgs might even be defeated. And this is the point at which Richelieu and Louis XIII entered the war, but on the side of the Lutherans. Again, in the ultimate example of rational politics, raison d'etat, putting the interests of the state ahead of all other interests. And in an astonishing show of how the church and its influence and the power of Roman Catholicism as a unifying force has now dissipated as the modern era dawned. They entered the war on the side of the Lutherans. It didn't bring about a swift end to the war. Spain invaded France from the south, and that forced the French to fight for their own territory, so they couldn't really make a full commitment of their resources to fighting the Habsburgs, so the war did drag on, and peace was not achieved until 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia essentially, for all intents and purposes, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. It remained, technically, in name, the Holy Roman Empire remained. The German princes continued to elect an emperor, but the emperor was stripped of all real powers, and the German states, each of them was sort of affirmed as sovereign and independent and self-governing. The Habsburg family themselves could not serve anymore as Holy Roman emperors. The Peace of Westphalia also saw the independence of Switzerland established. It had been a possession of the Austrian Habsburgs. Now in the Peace of Westphalia, it was made independent. And in the Peace of Westphalia, the independence of the Netherlands was established. Specifically, that portion of the Netherlands that was primarily Protestant. the portion which is today the country of the Netherlands. The portion of the Spanish Netherlands, which is today the country of Belgium, remained a Spanish possession because the people living there were primarily Roman Catholic. So, following the Peace of Westphalia, you have the partition of the Netherlands into the Netherlands, a new independent state that is primarily Protestant. And then on the other hand, the Spanish Netherlands to the south, which is today Belgium, which remained part of Spain's empire and which was primarily Roman Catholic. So the Peace of Westphalia had repercussions all across the Habsburg territories in Germany, or rather the Holy Roman Empire, in Spain, and in the Netherlands, and Switzerland as well. Additionally, the Peace of Westphalia acknowledged a marriage which had resulted in the creation of a state called Prussia, that will come to be called Prussia. The Prussian state was ruled by the Hohenzollern family, Hohenzollern, the Hohenzollern family. And that family will build Prussia into a strong state that will challenge ultimately the Habsburgs for leadership of the German nation, the Volk. And now shifting to the Netherlands again. Now, though, in the decades following 1648, and really for the next 70 years, the new independent Netherlands will face a whole different threat. Spain had been defeated, but now the new king of France, following the 30 Years' War, Louis XIV, he had designs on the territory of the Netherlands, the Spanish Netherlands and the Netherlands itself. Because one of Louis XIV's foreign policy goals was to expand France to what he called its natural borders. And going back into the era of the Romans, the Rhine River had been the boundary between Roman Gaul, which evolved into France, and then sort of barbarian Germania on the other side. And so Louis XIV defined the Rhine River as the natural border of France. He had built up a massive army, and on 3 different occasions waged war in an effort to seize territory from the Spanish Netherlands, from the Netherlands, and so on. 3 different wars: the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, and the War of the League of Augsburg, all fought in the second half of the 17th century, and all fought over territory in between the modern-day borders of France and the Rhine River, including then the modern-day country of Belgium and the Netherlands, and Luxembourg as well. What's interesting is that although France had built this great massive army, Louis XIV was thwarted in all 3 cases. Don't get me wrong, he gained territory for France, but he never was successful in really absorbing all of this territory into the French state. And the chief reason was what was known as the balance of power. It comes into play, the balance of power, when one state becomes so strong, so powerful, that its very existence is regarded as a threat by its neighbors. And so the neighbors band together and they unite and they form an alliance to perhaps fight and defeat that growing power, that growing hegemon, as they call it, and bring the power back into balance. And for this reason, France, under Louis XIV, was not successful in seizing the Netherlands or its neighbors in any of those 3 wars. Louis XIV then turned his attention to Spain, and so now talking about Spain, so back to that row, because the Habsburg line passed out of existence at the end of the 17th century. And Louis had very carefully and successfully, through marriage, positioned his grandson, Philippe Bourbon, to be the successor to the throne of Spain. But Philippe was young, and too young to rule, and so Louis XIV had sort of offered himself up generously to serve as regent until Philippe was ready to actually rule. Of course, this meant that essentially France and Spain would be united as one country. And again, this triggered a balance of power response from the other European countries. And so you get what's called the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 until 1714, a war to determine whether France would be allowed to absorb Spain. The war went badly for France and Spain. It was essentially France and Spain against the rest of Europe. a grand alliance of countries led by the British. But in 1713, a treaty was negotiated which brought an end to this destructive war. It was the Treaty of Utrecht. And interestingly, the Treaty of Utrecht allowed Philippe Bourbon to take control of Spain. He was allowed to ascend to the throne of Spain. You say, well, how would this happen? After all, preventing him from taking the throne of Spain was the main cause of the war. The reason why he was allowed was that by this time he had come of age to govern for himself, and Louis XIV had also passed on by now. And so the kinds of fears that triggered the war were no longer operational. However, although Philippe Bourbon was allowed to take the throne, a provision of the Treaty of Utrecht stated that, however, the thrones of Spain and France could never be united. One of the other provisions of the Treaty of Utrecht was at this time that the Spanish Netherlands, again today Belgium, passed into the hands of the Austrian Habsburgs. So Spain ceased to be a Habsburg-ruled state. It was now a Bourbon-ruled state. This is the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty, which lasted until the end of the 19th century in Spain. So the Habsburg dynasty from essentially 1556 up through 1701, and then the Bourbon dynasty from essentially 1714 until late 1880s. The Bourbon will rule Spain, but now Austrian Habsburgs now took control of Spain's possession of the southern part of the Netherlands, which is today Belgium. But that's not all that the Austrian Habsburgs came to possess at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century. At this time, the Ottoman Empire, which had expanded into southeastern Europe through the Balkans back in the 1300s and 1400s, was now entering into a period of decline. And as the Ottoman Empire began its decline and began its withdrawal back into a sort of Asia Minor, the Austrian Habsburgs sort of moved into southeastern Europe and seized those territories from the Ottomans. It was quite a remarkable turn of events because on more than one occasion, Ottoman forces were penetrating deep into the heart of Habsburg territory, and indeed, as late as 1689, an Ottoman army was besieging Vienna. And yet, the decline of the Ottomans was quite precipitous. It happened quite quickly, and the forces of Habsburg Austria were then able to move into southeastern Europe, into the Balkans, and displace the Ottomans and replace them as the new overlords of the various nations and ethnicities of people who lived there. This was all sealed up in a treaty called the Treaty of Karlowitz, Karlowitz, Treaty of Karlowitz, in which in 1699 Habsburg Austria officially took control of the former Ottoman territories in sort of southeastern Europe. This includes the modern states of Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, sort of parts of Romania, and so on, parts of Hungary. And what this meant for the Habsburgs was that they had bounced back pretty well, from their defeat in 1648. Over the next 60 years or so, they had regained territory. They had gained new territory. They may have lost their leadership of the German people, but they were now the rulers of those who would become the Belgian people, as well as many in the Balkans. Now, that was a challenge because it meant that they were becoming an increasingly multi-ethnic, multinational empire. Habsburg Austria was said to be a Slavic house with a German facade. That 90% of the subjects of the Austrian Habsburgs were now not ethnically German. Only 10% in an enclave around Vienna were ethnically German. So you are going to run into the problem of the extreme ethnic diversity of this empire. And the Habsburgs struggled with that. They found that they could not easily unite the ethnicities. They were able to force them into an army, and the army was essentially functional But you're going to find that by 1914, that army ceased to really be functional, and they're going to perform very badly in World War I. So the Habsburgs were faced with a challenge growing out of their success in expanding their territory, but the challenge of how to manage the ethnically diverse people who lived there. And then another challenge, one emerging from the fact that the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI did not produce a male heir. He produced a daughter, Maria Theresa, but no male heir. And so, as his life wound down, he began to promulgate a pragmatic sanction. Now, this is not the pragmatic sanction of Bourges issued in France in the 1400s. This is a pragmatic sanction which called upon his own nobles and other heads of state of Europe to sanction, to acknowledge, to recognize his daughter Maria Theresa as his legitimate heir. And all of the heads of state of Europe did so. And in 1717, upon the death of her father, Maria Theresa did ascend to the throne of Habsburg, Austria. Well, they were about to face another challenge, the Austrians, and that came from their rivals, or emerging rivals to the north, Prussia. They said Prussia was essentially formed out of a merger through marriage of lands across the northern tier of Germany, what is today Germany. The Hohenzollern family were the rulers of Prussia. And in 1688, Frederick Wilhelm I, Frederick Wilhelm Hohenzollern I, ascended to the throne of Prussia. He was determined to make Prussia into a great military power. And for this, he gained the nickname the Drill Master of Europe, and also the Sergeant King. And he essentially subordinated every aspect of Prussian life to the expansion and strengthening of Prussia's military. You know, by 1688, in France, if you were a noble and you were to advance in society, or you were seeking status in French society, the only way to do that was by doing something special, spying on your fellow nobles, for example, for Louis XIV. But as of 1688, advancement status in Prussian society was based entirely upon your performance on the battlefield. And all Prussian nobles were required to be military officers, and their social status was entirely based upon that performance. All of Prussia's tax revenues were directed towards strengthening the military. Frederick Wilhelm once said that all of the most beautiful works of art in Europe are not worth the bones of a single Prussian grenadier, and so he tended not to dedicate a lot of his resources to these things that he thought would be a distraction from the development of Prussian society into a militaristic society. In a lot of ways, it was sort of a modern Sparta. And he did succeed in strengthening Prussia's military. He built it up, doubled its size, doubled it again, to the point where it was a near match in terms of size for that of France. He established his own military academy so that his officers would be well trained, like France's. And so by the time he died, he left Prussia in the position of being a much stronger state than when he picked it up. And Prussia was emerging with that commercial economy as well, because of their long coastline on the Baltic Sea. They had ports, and their economy was beginning to modernize in a lot of the same way that the other Western European economies of France and the Netherlands and Britain had modernized. And so when Frederick Wilhelm died, the rule of the Kingdom of Prussia was passed on to his son, Frederick. And this is Frederick II, who came to be known as Frederick the Great. It wasn't always that way. Frederick was very different from his father. Frederick appreciated the arts, appreciated music, liked to read and write poetry, liked to play the flute, that kind of thing. And for a time he was quite estranged from his father, alienated. But in time he he and his father reconciled, and so that reconciliation took place in time for him to ascend to the throne upon his father's death in 1740. But immediately, Frederick, who had, and part of the reason why he had managed to reconcile with his father was because of his own excellent performance on the battlefield. He had fought excellently. He had led soldiers excellently in the War of Polish Succession, which we don't get a lot into. But anyway, upon ascending to the throne, Frederick, for the part of Prussia, abrogated or rejected the Pragmatic Sanction and rejected Maria Theresa's legitimacy as the Empress of Austria and invaded Austria. The Prussian army entered into the region called Silesia, Silesia, what proved to be a very it was an agriculturally rich area, an area of large population, and also proved to be a very mineral resource rich area as well. This sparked a war known as the War of Austrian Succession, and other countries of Europe sort of joined in, the French on the side of Prussia, the British ultimately on the side of Austria, and the Spanish on the side of Prussia as well. This was contemporaneous then with the War of Jenkins' Ear, which the British and the Spanish were already fighting. The armies of Prussia performed excellently, but Prussia's allies were perhaps not as into this war as Prussia was, and in the end, Prussia made a separate peace with Austria, and in doing so gained that rich territory of Silesia. But that was really the only major important territorial change as a result of the War of Austrian Succession. It was the negotiations between the other powers that were fighting resulted largely in the pre-war status quo. So it seems that that Prussia was beginning to gain ground on Austria. Both of them were led by ethnically German royal families, the Hapsburgs of Austria, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia. And in a future German state, certainly one of those two royal families would be the leaders to rule. But now, whereas before it would have been a foregone conclusion that would be the Habsburgs, now by the mid-18th century, the Hohenzollerns were certainly gaining on them. Frederick the Great, in terms of his domestic policy, also was sort of a revolutionary figure because he was one of those monarchs who was known as an enlightened monarch or an enlightened despot. Their era, the era of the enlightened despots, was sort of the second half of the 18th century, a period in which Frederick the Great ruled Prussia. And it meant that there were monarchs who were influenced by the thinkers and writers of the Enlightenment. And many of these, although they didn't necessarily accept constitutional limits on their power, far from it, many of them actually consolidated and increased their power. They embraced some of the principles of the Enlightenment, such as civil liberties for their people, and promotion of the arts and sciences. So, for example, in Prussia, Frederick the Great established royal academies for the promotion of the arts and sciences. He developed a system of public schools so that all of his subjects could be adequately educated. He promoted freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and he initiated what was at that time trumped or equaled anyway Great Britain's Act of Toleration as the most liberal proclamation for freedom of worship in Europe. Certainly the most liberal approach to freedom of worship on the continent of Europe at that time. Basically, freedom of worship for all Christians. His later counterpart, after the death of Maria Theresa, her son Joseph II, also gained that reputation as an enlightened monarch. Joseph II was also a famous for his patronage of the arts. As a matter of fact, Joseph II became well known through the film Amadeus for his patronage of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But Joseph II was in some ways even more radical as an enlightened monarch than Frederick the Great was. Joseph II actually issued a proclamation declaring an end to serfdom in Habsburg, Austria. So he took his enlightenment sort of a step farther in some ways than Frederick the Great had. Now, what was about to happen then was the outbreak of the French Revolution. And Frederick the Great died in 1786, 3 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution. Joseph II died in 1790, the year after it broke out. And Joseph and the Austrians were particularly interested in what was going on in France because it was Joseph's sister, Marie Antoinette, his younger sister, Marie Antoinette, who had married Louis XVI of France. When the revolution broke out, so many of France's monarchs and clergy, the First and Second Estate, emigrated out of France. The 200,000 emigres who fled mostly to places like Prussia and Austria. And there they told tales of how awful it was in France, of how the peasants were staging violent acts of uprising against the nobles and the clergy. And the immediate reaction of Austria and Prussia was sort of not really to get involved in this revolution. In fact, they jointly issued what was known as the Declaration of Pillnitz, which essentially said that they would be prepared to enter France and invade France for the purpose of overturning the revolution, but only if everybody else in Europe did the same. So not exactly a demonstration of great leadership there. But when the Girondins, the radicals who took control of France's National Assembly or Legislative Assembly, when they decided to attempt to export the French Revolution to their French-speaking brothers in the Austrian Netherlands, remember what is today Belgium was the Austrian Netherlands following the Treaty of Utrecht and War of Spanish Succession, when they decided to try to export their revolution into the Austrian Netherlands, they found themselves at war nevertheless against the French, and the Prussians joined them. And it was Austrian and Prussian armies that invaded France initially and helped to spark the rise of the Jacobins there. Well, the French armies, fighting for a nation who were willing to mobilize everything they had to preserve this new system of government that they believed served their interests rather than the interest of a privileged few, the French armies did quite well in defeating or at least fighting off, defending themselves against the invasions of the Prussians and Austrians. And indeed were able to strike back when Napoleon Bonaparte took command of France's armies in the south. Bonaparte invaded northern Italy, which was at that time an Austrian possession of the Austrian Hapsburgs, and really did a number on their armies in northern Italy, forcing the Austrians to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, in which the Austrians conceded both northern Italy and the Austrian Netherlands to revolutionary France. But Napoleon's string of victories against the Germans, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, did not end there. He defeated the combined forces of Austria and Russia in a legendary victory at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and having essentially exposed the weakness of Austria, he then threatened many of the German states that were part of the former Holy Roman Empire to join in a tight confederation with him, which is known as the Confederation of the Rhine. This brought Prussia back into the war against revolutionary France, but Napoleon then defeated the Prussians at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt before turning his forces eastward toward the Russians and defeating them at Friesenland. But the reality is that by the year 1807, both Austria and Prussia had been soundly defeated by Napoleon, their capitals occupied, and their royal families, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, had been forced to sign treaties binding themselves to Napoleon, paying a tribute to him, allowing their armies to be conscripted into his, and essentially agreeing to commit themselves to Napoleon's policies, including the adoption of the Napoleonic Code and Napoleon's continental system, his effort to destroy Britain's economy. The Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns kept their thrones, but that was the price they paid to do that. It was also at this time, then, shortly thereafter, that the Habsburgs married another daughter, Marie-Louise, to Napoleon, and she became his wife that bore him an heir. And now we'll turn to Spain for a little while here, because in Spain is where Napoleon began to run into trouble. Shortly after his signature victories over Austria, Prussia, and Russia, he instituted the continental system, in which he demanded that essentially no one trade with Britain in an effort to deny Britain a market for their goods. But Portugal, a longtime ally of Britain, continued to trade with the British, and Napoleon was determined to punish them and impose his will on them. He had made treaties with Spain already, but in marching his forces through Spain to get to Portugal, he ran into problems. The Spanish people, who had no love for France, they regarded France as the Spanish people regarded themselves as strongly Catholic. They regarded France ever since the Revolution as almost atheist. They waged a sort of what's called guerrilla war. It was not the Spanish army that was fighting the French as they marched through, but the Spanish people waging guerrilla war, little war, guerrilla, little war, guerrilla. And they essentially would ambush Napoleon's armies and attack his garrisons in an effort to harass that army and sort of bleed it to death. Napoleon attempted to get the King of Spain to suppress the guerrilla warriors. He was either unable or unwilling to do so, and so Napoleon replaced him with his brother Joseph. Joseph Bonaparte remained King of Spain for the next 6 years. But that only brought Spain's army into the war, and then the British, quite impressed with how well and how thoroughly harassed Napoleon's army was, the British then sent troops under the Duke of Wellington. And this whole war became known as the Peninsular War, because it was fought for control of, and it was fought in the Iberian Peninsula. And this war lasted through the end of Napoleon's reign as emperor, and really was a major drain. Although typically the final defeat of Napoleon is associated with the invasion of Russia, the Peninsular War definitely drained Napoleon's military resources at a time when he couldn't afford it, because he was about to invade Russia. Finally, after Napoleon's defeat, he's exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He returned, managed to seize control of France and ruled France for another 100 days, during which he assembled a French army and headed northward into what is today Belgium. At that time, was probably on the verge of being returned to Austria, maybe, as the Austrian Netherlands, maybe not. The discussions at the Congress of Vienna were still going on about the fate of that territory. But at that point, Napoleon engaged the Prussians in battle, defeated them at the Battle of Ligny, but the Prussians came back and essentially provided the final blow to Napoleon when he was heavily engaged with the British at the Battle of Waterloo. It is the Prussian cavalry under Gebhard von Blücher who finally defeated his armies, and drove him to the field and forced him into his final exile on the island of St. Helena. This also contributed to the growing sense of Prussia as the leader of the German people, because whereas Austria had been seen, the Habsburgs had been seen to want to sort of, I suppose, literally jump into bed with their conqueror Napoleon by marrying off their daughter to him. On the other hand, it was the Prussians who were seen to have led the resistance against him. So you're starting to see the building of a case for Prussia as the leaders of a German state, if that German state ever were to come into existence. But in the meantime, the monarchs had to sit down together and talk about how they were going to reshape Europe in the wake of Napoleon's defeat. Because Napoleon had essentially swept across Europe and had changed everything He had brought a lot of the principles of the French Revolution. He had brought Napoleon's Code. And when he was washed back, it was like a sort of tsunami that washed across Europe. And when it washed back, everything was different. So at the Congress of Vienna, the monarchs, those who had played a role in defeating Napoleon, had gathered to try to figure out how they were going to turn back the clock. They wanted to turn back the clock to a time when Europe was safe for monarchy, a time when they weren't constantly afraid of what their peasant class might do if they got the revolutionary ideas in their head. And the leader of the Congress of Vienna was an Austrian prince, Clemens von Metternich. Metternich sort of set the tone and set the agenda for the Congress of Vienna, and essentially he proposed a variety of steps. On the one hand, he proposed that all of the legitimate monarchs, the legitimate royal families, that is, those who were in power prior to Napoleon, he proposed that they be restored to power. So, for example, that the Bourbon be restored to power in Spain. After, you're going to strip Joseph Bonaparte off that throne, restore the Bourbon. That the Bourbon be restored to power in France as well, and so on. He also proposed that those who had contributed to the defeat of Napoleon be compensated with territories that Napoleon had conquered. So, for example, the Austrian Netherlands, which had been part of Austria prior to the war, had been conquered by France, actually were given to the Netherlands. They became part of the Netherlands as an acknowledgement of the role of the Dutch in helping to defeat Napoleon. And that is ultimately going to cause problems because ethnically the people of the Austrian Netherlands, today Belgium, were quite different in terms of their culture from the Dutch. On the other hand, the territory that Napoleon had designated as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is today Poland, that's going to be carved up. Don't shed a tear for the Austrians because they're going to take their share of that, and indeed had done so in the past already in the partitions of Poland. Prussia will get some. Russia will get the lion's share of that. Territory in northern Italy will revert to Austria, and so on. And another principle that Metternich established at Vienna that was also served by attaching what is today Belgium to the Netherlands was to box in France, to sort of contain France by building strong states around it. But at one point they had to sort of compromise because to the east of France you have the German states. Again, this sort of this hodgepodge of states, which many of which were tiny and disunited and weak. They had been forced into a confederation called the Confederation of the Rhine by Napoleon during the war, and the problem was this: it would have been, for the purpose of attempting to contain France, it probably would have been best to try to forge a single unified German state out of those many little disunited states. But the problem of who would rule that single united German state was a sticky one. Would it be Prussia? Would it be Austria? Just considering that question could have led to war. So instead, they sort of stole Napoleon's idea and established what was known as the German Confederation. The German Confederation was a tight alliance of German states, and they were jointly bound to Prussia and Austria. In the sort of Diet of the German Confederation, Prussia and Austria shared the chair. So that was their solution to the problem of German disunity and the desire to have some sort of strong presence to the east of France. But beyond that, Metternich's goal, and the goal that he sort of endowed to all of the monarchs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the Bourbon, the Brits, everybody, the Russians, was to ensure that there would never be another outbreak of revolution like Europe had experienced in the French Revolution. As we said, the whole thing had been really, really scary for the monarchs. And their goal at Vienna is to turn the clock back to pre-1789, when Europe's monarchs felt and were safe in being monarchs. So he proposed an alliance of conservative states built around a conservative consensus. Never again, right? They were anti-radical, and This alliance was known first as the Holy Alliance and then later on as the Quadruple Alliance. And it bound together Austria, Prussia, Russia, initially Britain, but eventually Britain will drop out and will enter into a period of isolationism, and actually France will join them. And essentially their purpose was to ensure that no revolution would ever grow into maturity ever again. That the first sign of a revolt that might pose the potential for revolution, these states would be committed to go in and crush it. The Austrians and the Russians proved to be particularly enthusiastic enforcers of this idea. And so this quadruple alliance gave rise to it was a manifestation of what was being referred to now as the concert of Europe. It was a sort of a diplomatic equilibrium. During the 18th century, the states of Europe were constantly at war with each other over territory. And now, following the defeat of Napoleon in the 19th century, the tone that Metternich and the other monarchs were setting was one of equilibrium, one of unity. The monarchs are now all on the same page. They have embraced a set of shared values, specifically stability, conservatism, peace, and they will all fight for the same thing. They'll fight for that set of values. And so instead of having these ongoing rivalries, ongoing wars over control of territory, they will be united around this one cause, keeping everything stable and quiet. A little peace and quiet, that's what they wanted. So that's the concert of Europe. And it operated really for about 40 years before it broke apart as a result of the Crimean War. But also part of this was something known as the Metternich system, which was an approach to suppressing revolts internally. The idea is that the Quadruple Alliance was sort of like firefighters, and their job was to go in and put out fires before they spread. But the Metternich system was also about fire prevention. So in what ways do you prevent radical ideas from taking root and sparking revolts which could grow into mature revolutions? So Clemens von Metternich in 1819, in what were known as the Carlsbad Decrees, proposed a whole series of ideas, policies, that he and the Prussians jointly required all the German states to adopt, and then many other states of Europe on their own chose to adopt them. These included strict restrictions on speech and the press, censorship, prior restraint of the press, strict limits on academic freedom. Teachers and professors could be stripped of their professions if they were seen to be promoting what were considered to be radical ideas. And radical ideas in the eyes of the monarchs were really just what would have been considered in those days liberal ideas: constitutional government, civil liberties, property rights, national identity, things like that. And even the establishment of secret police, because it was known that there were already afoot secret societies looking to promote these liberal values and these national ethnic identities. And the secret police's job was to go in and penetrate those societies and destroy them, expose them, and eliminate them. So this was all part of the plan established by Metternich and embraced by the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and just about all the other monarchs in Europe in an effort to ensure that they didn't deal with another round of revolutions. The problem was that that national identity in particular was beginning to emerge as an issue of passion in Europe. So the concept of nationalism, which had essentially been born in the first part of the 19th century, embraced the idea that every culture was unique in and of itself, and then the idea of political nationalism furthermore embraced that every nation of people, so a nation of people is a group of people who are bound together by a shared cultural heritage and sort of separated from everybody else by a shared cultural heritage, but that each nation deserved to be self-governing. Each nation deserved to not be unduly influenced by outsiders. Each nation, therefore, deserved its own state, ought to be governed by its own people. And that idea was promoted by Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian, and gradually spread throughout Europe. And Mazzini was the founder of an organization called Giovanni Italia, Young Italy, and ultimately branch offices essentially were established all throughout Europe. And the organization as a whole became known as Young Europe. What was Young Europe dedicated to? Well, they were dedicated to promoting national identity, particularly in places where nations of people were being ruled by foreigners. And essentially they were dedicated to redrawing the map. Whereas at the Congress of Vienna, the Metternich system was designed to solidify the political borders that they established. Many of those borders had no relationship whatsoever with the boundaries of the nations, the ethnic boundaries of Europe. And political nationalists proposed to redraw that by essentially separating the conquered nations from the foreigners who ruled over them and allowing them to establish their own states. That's what Young Europe was all about, and Young Europe was responsible for the series of revolts that broke out all across Europe in 1848. In many places, Young Europe also promoted liberal values, again, constitutional government, civil liberties, property rights, and so on. Not in all places, but in many places. And so both liberalism and nationalism were seen by Metternich and his fellow monarchs as examples of dangerous radical ideas that needed to be stamped out. And that's what these secret societies were promoting. Young Europe was a good example, and that's what the Metternich system was designed to crush. But they were not, in a lot of ways, fully successful. The first nationalist revolution that was successful actually was not against any of the German leaders, but it was against the Spanish. The Spanish had this massive empire that they had established in the Americas, and they administered that empire by sending Spanish-born administrators into the empire. Increasingly, those who lived in the empire, born in the Americas, and oftentimes of mixed ethnicity, Spanish and American ethnicity, people known as Creoles, and who oftentimes refer to themselves as Americans, they resented the fact that they were shut out of the leadership positions. And particularly, some of them became wealthy in commerce. They sent their children to European universities. They were highly educated. And they were led then, this group of Creoles, or Americans, as, again, many of them called themselves, they then led a revolt against Spanish rule. Two major leaders of these nationalist revolts, because they were nationalist revolts, because the Creoles, in calling themselves Americans, considered themselves to have separated themselves from Spanish culture. And they regarded the Spanish peninsulare administrators as foreigners ruling over them. Two major leaders, Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, both led successful revolutions against Spanish authorities in South America and began the process of driving the Spanish out of their colonies throughout America. Another successful nationalist revolt took place against the Netherlands. As we mentioned, the state of the Netherlands had gained its independence in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia, had been granted the former Spanish/Austrian Netherlands, today Belgium, at the Congress of Vienna as a form of compensation for their role in defeating Napoleon. But the people of what is today Belgium were so different from the people of the Netherlands. First of all, the people of Belgium were for the most part speakers of French, Walloon. The region is called Wallonia. The people are called Walloons. They speak essentially French, whereas their Dutch overlords spoke Dutch, which was closer to German. The Dutch were mostly Protestant. This is dating back to the establishment of the Dutch Reformed Church, whereas those who live in Belgium today, they were mostly Roman Catholic, more like the French. And then their ways of making a living were very different. The Netherlands, after its independence in 1648, had become a republic. But it was a republic much along the lines of, say, the Florentine Republic or the Pisan Republic in northern Italy back during the Renaissance. It was not an American-style democratic republic, representative democracy, but rather a republic, an oligarchy, in which powerful interests ruled in the name of the people. And although you had nobles, a lot of the wealth and power was increasingly gained by merchants and bankers. Indeed, those were the two drivers of the Dutch economy, commerce and banking. By the 1660s, the Dutch had built a commercial fleet to rival the British. As a matter of fact, the British went to war with the Dutch during the 1660s and seized from the Dutch a colony. The Dutch had established what is today New York. And in the Anglo-Dutch War in 1664, the English had defeated the Dutch and taken it from them. But the Dutch were a major rival of the British. The Dutch had established colonies in what is today Indonesia. And they had also built one of the most powerful banks in Europe, Bank of Amsterdam. This was a time, the late 17th century, of great cultural flowering as well in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was one of the most religiously tolerant states in Europe. It had been born out of religious intolerance. Right? Their resistance to Spanish rule came out of Spain's intolerance of the Dutch Reformed Church. And so the Netherlands was quite tolerant, more so even before Frederick the Great. They had become a target for religious minorities, religious dissidents, Calvinists, so on. René Descartes, a great example. And so, with all that foreign talent flowing in, it was a time of great cultural flowering. There was a period during which the Netherlands was home to some of the most well-established artists outside of Italy, and you have an entire sort of Flemish Dutch Renaissance. Artists like Rembrandt van Rijn, Peter Bruegel the Elder, Van Eyck, and so on. So it's a period of wealth and cultural flowering. But as I mentioned, by the time you get into the 19th century, their economy is very well established as a modern, commerce-based, finance-based economy. On the other hand, the Walloons of the former Austrian Netherlands, they're more agriculture-based. And whereas free trade was essential to the survival and success of the Dutch economy, free trade meant a lot of competition and the driving down of agricultural prices for those living in the southern part. So in 1830, you have a revolution that resulted in the independence of Belgium. The Belgians revolted against Dutch rule and successfully made a revolution, and in 1830 became independent from the Netherlands. Shortly thereafter, they signed a treaty, the Belgians did. The new independent state of Belgium signed a treaty with the British, in which the British guaranteed their independence in order to protect themselves against the danger of some sort of rival state taking over there and using it as a jumping-off point for an invasion of Britain. But as I mentioned, the big year for radicalism in Europe was 1848. And in 1848, young Europe did its thing. Their intention in coordinating revolts all across Europe was to try to overwhelm the Metternich system, try to overwhelm the Quadruple Alliance. They couldn't put down revolts everywhere all at once, and so the idea was to stage them all at once. Then the spring and summer of 1848, that's exactly what happened. So of all the revolts that broke out in 1848, the one that posed the most serious threat to a German royal family was the 1848 liberal uprising in Vienna. Now, this was not a nationalist uprising. This was an uprising of liberals who wanted to see the Habsburg monarchy become more enlightened. And for a time, it actually managed to force the Habsburgs to flee from the city. And even Metternich himself was forced to flee from the city, essentially under disguise. And ultimately, the Habsburgs managed to get their army mobilized, and the army went in, and they managed to crush this uprising of liberals, and the Habsburg family was restored to power, although a new emperor ascended to the throne. The previous emperor was old and doddering, and now, with an abdication, the emperor Franz Joseph ascended to power. Franz Joseph was young. As a matter of fact, he ended up ruling Austria from 1848 through 1917, or maybe 1918, so a period of almost 70 years. And Franz Joseph, although young, was actually quite the opposite of what the liberals hoped for. He was extremely conservative, reactionary even, and under his leadership, the leaders of the liberal revolt were rounded up and executed, and he utterly rejected essentially all of the reforms that the liberals had proposed. Now, in time, you'll see that he'll make an interesting reform, but only under pressure. In that same year, then, 1848, the Magyars, the Hungarians, who were part of the Habsburg Empire, staged a national revolt led by Lajos Kossuth. Lajos, L-A-J-O-S, sometimes simply called Louis, L-O-U-I-S, Kossuth, K-O-S-S-U-T-H. They were inspired by the success that the liberals had, the initial success that the liberals had there in Vienna. It looked like the Habsburgs were on the run, and so now the Magyars, the Hungarians, staged a nationalist revolt against Habsburg rule. Where Kossuth seems to have gone wrong is in drafting and essentially declaring the Hungarians' independence and drafting a constitution. He did not really go out and seek the support of the many, many other ethnic groups that had at one time or another been conquered and absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. As a matter of fact, in preparing a constitution, he made the same mistake that the Emperor Joseph II had actually made back in the late 18th century. Joseph II had attempted to declare German to be the exclusive language of the empire, and the outrage of his Slavic nobles at this suggestion forced him to back off on it. Well, Lajos Kossuth made the same mistake, because in his proposed constitution, he made Magyar the exclusive language. That cost him any chance of really gaining the support of the other Slavic peoples, and in the end, his nationalist revolt was crushed with the assistance of the Russians, and he ended up fleeing into exile and spent the rest of his life sort of trying to preach the case for his people, but never really succeeded, except in as much as in 1867, actually after experiencing military defeat at the hands of the Sardinians/Italians and then the Prussians, not wanting to deal with the prospect of further internal disturbances, Franz Joseph did propose what became known as Ausgleich, A-U-S-G-L-E-I-C-H, Ausgleich, which essentially means compromise. And this was the establishment of a dual monarchy in which Austria would continue to be governed by the Habsburgs, and Hungary would also be governed by the Habsburgs, although functioning separately. In a sense, there would be two separate monarchies, although united in the same person. And this dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary would continue to function all the way through the end of World War I. And what it allowed was, it allowed the Hungarians a sort of separate autonomy in which they could make their own decisions about matters relating to their internal affairs. They were continued to be linked to the overall policy of Habsburg Austria in manners of monetary issues and trade and foreign affairs and war making, and there continued to be essentially one army, but it allowed for this dual monarchy, allowed for a certain amount of autonomy for the Hungarians. And I mentioned that came under the pressure not from the Hungarians, but rather from problems elsewhere. And those problems for Austria-Hungary, or for Austria, Habsburg Austria, started in Italy. Italy was the home of nationalism. It was the home of Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini had been inspired by a group called the Carbonari. The Carbonari, C-A-R-B-O-N-A-R-I, were a secret society of liberals and nationalists who proposed to eliminate all of the foreign influence over Italy at a time when northern Italy was governed by the Austrians, essentially. Southern Italy was governed by the Spanish, and the center of Italy was still the Papal States, but was fully and very much influenced by the French. And so the Carbonari were a secret society who disguised themselves as charcoal burners, people who made charcoal, but they were a liberal and nationalist organization. They had staged revolts against foreign rule and had been defeated, crushed. Out of this then was born Giovanni Italia, Young Italy, which was Mazzini's organization. They attempted in 1830 and then again in 1848 to kick the foreigners out of Italy, and they too were crushed in both cases. Mazzini had always, there was really two areas in which Mazzini was quite idealistic and maybe too idealistic. Number one is he always believed that the Italians could do it on their own, that they didn't need any outside help to get rid of the outsiders. And then also he had hoped for Italy to become a national republic. After the defeat of Young Italy's revolts in 1848, he had to flee into exile. And the leadership of the Italian nationalist movement and the Italian unification movement fell to a Sardinian named Camillo di Cavour, C-A-V-O-U-R, Camillo di Cavour. Cavour was a publisher of a Italian nationalist newspaper called Il Risorgimento, R-I-S-O-R-G-I-M-E-N-T-O, Il Risorgimento. It means the resurgence. And he was able to publish this in Sardinia because it was the only part of Italy that was governed by native Italians. The Kingdom of Sardinia, also known as Sardinia/Piedmont, comprised the island of Sardinia and then a region of Italy in the northwest, centered on the city of Milano, and also Torino, or Turin. And it was the only part of Italy that was governed by native Italians. The king of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel, was interested in the proposal of uniting all of Italy under Italian rule. And Camillo di Cavour, the publisher of this newspaper, Il Risorgimento, proposed just that. But Cavour was different from Mazzini, inasmuch as his focus was on establishing a nation-state, not necessarily a national republic. He was willing to accept a monarchy, whereas Mazzini was not. And therefore he could gain the support and the power that goes with the support of a guy like Victor Emmanuel. And Cavour was more of a diplomat, didn't necessarily believe that the Italians could or should attempt to do this without outside help. And so with Victor Emmanuel's assent, he opened up negotiations with Napoleon III of France. France and Sardinia had been allies in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and the Sardinian troops had performed quite well, and Napoleon III of France was always looking for ways to demonstrate the influence of France outside of its little box that had been built for it, by the monarchs at Congress of Vienna. And so he aligned with the Sardinians, or Sardinians/Piedmontese, and they waged war on Austria and northern Italy. With French help, the Sardinians drove Austrian forces out of the region of Lombardy. And then at that point, the French sort of precipitously ended their support. I wonder if maybe Napoleon III had not bargained on the defeat of the Austrians being so easy, and maybe he feared that if he supported the Sardinians all the way through to the end, they would build a strong Italian state that would become a rival for France. Regardless of the reason, after driving the Austrians out of Lombardy, the French withdrew their support. But at that point, inspired by the defeat of the Austrians, Italian citizens, perhaps provoked also directly by the Sardinians, in places like Tuscany and Parma and Modena, they began to rise up in revolt against Austrian rule. And finally, the Habsburgs conducted a plebiscite there They felt that perhaps that they did not have the resources to try to control a population that was adamantly and irrevocably opposed to being ruled by them. So they conducted a plebiscite among them, and the Tuscans and those of Modena and Parma, they sought to become independent, and that was granted by the Habsburgs. They then joined with Sardinia-Piedmont to form the earliest basis of an Italian state. That left only Venetia, which is centered on the city of Venice, in the hands of the Austrians in northern Italy. In the meantime, something quite unexpected and quite surprising, probably shocking, maybe even disturbing to Cavour, because it was not part of his plan, was happening in southern Italy. Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had been a member of Young Italy, who also fled into exile after the failure of the revolts in 1848, had traveled elsewhere, including in the United States, and had recruited a group of 1,000 Italian nationals who were in exile, who volunteered, and they landed in Sicily, and they were known as the Red Shirts, because as a group they wore red shirts. And they waged war against the occupying Spanish, first on the island of Sicily, and then crossing over to the mainland and driving toward Naples, which was the administrative capital of the Spanish possessions in Italy. As they went, they recruited more and more, and their numbers grew. And then the Sardinian Piedmontese forces fought their way south through the Papal States and joined up with Garibaldi's forces to besiege the Spanish in Naples. Now, it's not known whether Cavour had ordered his men to fight their way through to join the siege of Naples because he wanted to support Garibaldi, or he wanted to make sure that Garibaldi could not, on his own, claim control of southern Italy, because at the time it was unclear whether Garibaldi was entirely on the same team as the Sardinian Piedmontese. As a member of Young Italy, perhaps he would not agree to join his conquests in southern Italy with those of Sardinia and northern Italy. But in the end, they drove the Spanish out. The Spanish garrison at Naples surrendered to a force superior in number. And in the end, Garibaldi handed over southern Italy to Victor Emmanuel and Cavour. And with that, in 1862, Victor Emmanuel was crowned in Torino, he was crowned the King of Italy, Padre della Patria, Father of the Fatherland, the first king of United Italy. Now, in being crowned in this manner in 1862, of course, there was still unfinished business. Venetia in the northeast, centered on Venice, was still in the hands of the Austrians, and Rome and the core of the Papal States, although some had been taken, but the core of the Papal States centered around Rome was still in the hands of the Pope and was under the control and under the protection of the French. Now, at this point, we got to pivot back to Germany, because at this point, the story of the unification and establishment of an Italian state becomes linked with that of the unification of Germany. So, the German nation had been fragmented among many, many states, dozens of states, most of them tiny little things, statelets, as I like to call them, or mini principalities, for 1,000 years by the time that the German state was finally established. Again, this was a product of going all the way back to medieval times of the practice of partible inheritance by the Franks. But there was a sense, however, that the Germans were one nation, a unique nation separated from everybody else by their cultural heritage, and that nation was known in German as the Volk, the nation. And by the 19th century, a thought had begun to grow among many Germans that was known as Blut und Boden. Blut und Boden, blood and soil. That the blood of the German people was one, and it was tied to the soil. In a sense, wherever Germans lived, that was Germany. And the impulse to unite the German nation under one leader, with one state, was beginning to grow following the defeat of Napoleon. The in Prussia, there was a growing sense that Prussia ought to lead this movement. There was not an equal sense probably in Austria of that. But in Prussia, there was also a growing liberal movement that sought to particularly in the economic realm, liberalize policy. And so in the mid-19th century, the Zollverein, which was a free trade union, was established among the German states. This was within the German Confederation. So on the one hand, you have the German Confederation, which is a political alliance of the German states. The Zollverein trade union opened up a free trade bloc among the German states. And with goods flowing back and forth freely, the establishment of a German economy began to mirror the concept of the establishment of a German, or it began to presage the concept of a German state. It also strengthened Prussia even more. Prussia, with its outlet to the world, with its ports up on the Baltic, Prussia with its access to iron ore and steel, which was established when they took Silesia from Austria back in the War of Austrian Succession in the middle of the 18th century. Prussia, with its thriving economy and its strong military, was growing in strength, and that it drew resources in from the rest of Germany, and it grew economics. It developed even greater economic strength from that. So it was becoming clear that Prussia could certainly be the state around which a unified German state was founded. In 1848, you get an outbreak of revolt. Again, it's not necessarily a nationalist revolt exactly. It's a revolt of liberals. It's also a revolt of Germans who are enthusiastic about the idea of a unified German state. It's not so much about kicking the outsiders out, because most Germans were ruled by Germans, but it's about the idea of a unified German state. In 1848, they revolt. Frederick Wilhelm IV, the King of Prussia, crushed this revolt in Berlin, but he was not opposed to the ideas behind the revolt. He was not opposed to liberal ideas. He was not opposed to national ideas. What he was opposed to was the breaking of law and order. That's why he crushed the revolt. He countenanced, however, the creation of the Frankfurt Assembly, a meeting of delegates from all the German states with an eye toward creating a constitution for a German state. He countenanced that. He was not opposed to that. That was a type of change that he could get behind. It was done within the boundaries of the rules, as opposed to violent rebellion. The Frankfurt Assembly met for about a year, 1848-49, and it produced some interesting results. It produced a sort of Bill of Rights for the German people that mirrored those of the reign of Frederick the Great. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, property rights, the right to an education, freedom of worship. And it even created a constitution for a German state built around Prussia, not Austria. And that was a real issue. How would Prussia lay claim to the leadership of a German state and leave Austria behind? Well, on the one hand, there were many who felt it was only logical, since the Austrians ruled over more Slavic people than Germans. Again, only 10% of the population of Habsburg Austria was ethnically German. And so most Germans were not interested in having Austria be a part of this. Many Germans were not interested in having Austria be a part of this state, bringing in with them many who were not ethnically German. How would that work? So they had built their state around Prussia, but at the same time, essentially, had Prussia accepted this invitation, it would have invited war with Austria almost as the first act of the new German state. So that was a bit of a problem. The other problem with this constitution that they were offering Frederick Wilhelm IV, and they did, they essentially said that he would be the king of the new German state, was that none of the German princes, the rulers of these little German principalities, none of them were present at the Frankfurt Convention, or I'm sorry, the Frankfurt Assembly. And so in making an offer of a unified German state to Wilhelm, they really didn't have the authority to do that. They weren't authorized by the princes, to make this offer in which the princes would be surrendering their sovereignty to Prussia. And so Frederick Wilhelm IV rejected the thing, and that was that. That was probably too much change too fast. But one of the delegates there, Otto von Bismarck, was sort of disgusted by the whole thing. He was, although himself politically conservative on a lot of economic and rights issues, he was enthusiastic about the idea of the establishment of a German state, and he was sort of disgusted by how essentially Austria and the German princes had blocked this state from coming into existence. And so as he worked his way up, he was a diplomat, and then he worked his way up through the leadership of Prussia. And by the way, Frederick Wilhelm IV did, as a sort of consolation prize to his own people, the Prussian people, grant them a constitution with an elected legislature with which he shared to some degree political power. But increasingly this legislature was growing more independent in terms of their thinking and more rebellious, and they needed to be controlled to some degree. And so Otto von Bismarck, who had proved himself as a diplomat, was appointed as prime minister of Prussia. And he, in a speech in 1862, in a speech to the Parliament, the Prussian Parliament, he said, "Look, in the past we had opportunities to bring forth a unified German state, and the reason why those opportunities failed was because we sat around waiting for everybody to agree on it. And we hoped that persuasive speeches and votes and whatever would accomplish our goals." He said, "But that's not going to accomplish our goals. The only way to force this down the nobles' throats and to force this down Austria's throat is through the use of force." And he announced pretty openly that blood and iron, as he said, would decide whether a German state was created. And this reminds us that Otto von Bismarck was a practitioner of realpolitik, like, in some ways, Cardinal Richelieu, which raison d'etat is a synonym for realpolitik, like Machiavelli. He believed that certain measures, although maybe in some ways morally objectionable, such as war, bloodshed in the name of the state interest, although they might be objectionable, sometimes they were necessary. And you kind of had to do what you had to do. Your policy decisions had to be driven by the interest of the state and not be held back by any other interests. And so, for example, going to war, he felt was a reasonable, as long as it was a natural extension of policy, as long as warfare served a specific policy of the state and the specific interest of the state, it was a legitimate instrument of policy. He didn't believe that wars should be entered into recklessly or for emotional reasons, out of revenge or out of anger. He thought that was a poor reason to go to war. But when war was entered into with a specific goal that was within the interest of the state, it was a legitimate instrument of policy. And so he was prepared to go to war, and he did so first against Denmark, because there were regions of Denmark where ethnic Germans lived. These were Schleswig and Holstein. And he sought to make that part of Prussia as sort of the first step toward unifying the Germans, the German nation. He brought the Austrians in on this, and part of the reason he brought the Austrians in on this was that he was also quite aware of the phenomenon of the balance of power, and he knew that if Prussia was seen to act too rashly and was seen to be growing too quickly, this would become a threat to, a big, strong German state right in the center of Europe would be a threat to their neighbors, and they might unite to stop him. So he brought the Austrians in on the war against Denmark. It was all about Germans standing up for Germans, and they quickly defeated Denmark, and Schleswig became part of Prussia, and Holstein became part of Austria. But at the same time that he was doing this, he was preparing to make war on Austria. And he opened into secret negotiations with France's Napoleon III, because his greatest fear was that in fighting the Austrians, he would suddenly find himself fighting a two-front war, that the French perhaps might take advantage of Prussia having to fight Austria to try to expand. And so he managed to negotiate a non-aggression pact with Napoleon III. And he did so by promising Napoleon III that after Napoleon was humbled, and that really was the purpose of going to war with Austria, he knew that the German states, the German princes, would traditionally look to Austria for protection from, say, a growing Prussia. He needed to demonstrate to them that Austria could not protect them. He wanted to humble and expose Austria's weakness. And Austria was weak. It relied on this army of non-Germans who didn't necessarily have a good reason to fight for the Habsburgs anyway. But he basically told Napoleon III that after Austria was humbled and exposed, there would be some German states, particularly those that were Catholic, that would be looking for protection, and that he essentially would not object to Napoleon III making them a protectorate of France. So in return for that promise, Napoleon III agreed to a non-aggression pact. With that secured, Bismarck then entered into negotiations with Cavour and the Italians. And I mentioned, I said we have to stop talking about this at the moment because the story of the unification of Italy is now tied up with that of Germany. And he made an alliance with the Italians in which the Italians would at least mobilize their army on Austria's southern border at Venetia. And now, having secured himself and Prussia against fighting a two-front war, he had now manipulated Austria into having to do so. And so in 1866, we have the 7 Weeks' War, in which Prussia and the new Italian state waged war against Austria. Austria was forced to divide its forces to defend against a potential, or not just a potential, Prussian invasion, but a real Prussian invasion, and also send the other part of its army to the south to protect against a potential Italian invasion. This made the Austrian army easy pickings for the Prussians, and in a period of 7 weeks they defeated Austria. The resulting treaty, which was the Treaty of Prague, actually was not a very harsh treaty. In the Treaty of Prague, Italy received Venetia from Austria, and Prussia received Holstein, the recently conquered Holstein, from Austria. But Germany, Prussia, did not take any more territory from Austria than that. They did not intend to make permanent enemies out of the Austrians, and again, they didn't want to seem too overreaching and provoke a balance of power response. But the more important result was that in the eyes of all of the other German states, all the eyes of all the other German princes, Austria was now exposed for their weakness. And there was a realization that they could not count on Austria to protect them from anybody. And at that point, Bismarck went to the other German princes and said, look, you are now going to enter into a tight alliance with Prussia. It will be known as the North German Confederation. And essentially what he was telling them is that if they did not enter into this alliance and really surrender their sovereignty to Prussia and almost become part of Prussia, that he was simply going to run them over anyway. And so one by one, the German princes, who had been such a problem back in 1849, now, in face of the threat of Prussian force, came into line and joined the growing Prussian state. That included the princes of the southern Catholic states, which Bismarck had essentially promised he would not interfere with and would allow to become protectorates of France. This was a real outrage to Napoleon III. He had been double-crossed by Bismarck, and Napoleon III now angrily demanded to negotiate with the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, because he obviously felt that Bismarck was not someone with whom he could continue to negotiate. He had been double-crossed. Well, Wilhelm I went back and forth, and interestingly, at the same time, the last of the Spanish Bourbon kings died, or left the throne, and Bismarck had managed to negotiate Leopold Hohenzollern, a German prince of the Hohenzollern family, to be the heir to the throne of Spain. And that really sent Napoleon III over the edge, because it meant that he would be surrounded by Hohenzollerns. So these two incidents caused Napoleon III to seek the right to negotiate with Wilhelm I, and they went back and forth, and Wilhelm I promised that he withdrew Leopold Hohenzollern's claim to the throne of Spain, and essentially told Napoleon III, look, we now consider the the matter settled, and he really wasn't willing to negotiate the future of the Southern Catholic German states. Well, that was not enough for Napoleon III. He felt that he had been messed with, and he demanded now, perhaps to save face, he demanded now that not only would Wilhelm I promise that Leopold would not become the King of Spain, but that no Hohenzollern never would become the King of Spain. Well, Wilhelm I sort of politely wrote back to Napoleon III that he was not willing to make that promise, and that as far as he was concerned, they had settled the matter, and that was that. And he wrote this letter from the town of Ems, which was a spa town. Wilhelm I suffered from various maladies that he hoped would be settled by the hot springs. And Bismarck got a hold of his draft, and he essentially rewrote it. And he rewrote in what became known as the Ems Dispatch, a letter dispatched by the King of Prussia to the Emperor of France from Ems. And the way that Bismarck rewrote it made it sound like Wilhelm had been utterly dismissive of Napoleon. And Bismarck released it not only to Napoleon but also to French press, who published it in the newspapers. And suddenly the French people were outraged. They felt that France and its leader had been insulted by the Prussians. They demanded war. And this was just the kind of war, if France was to go to war with Prussia, this would be just the kind of war that Bismarck would say you should never fight. And yet he was provoking his rivals into fighting it because he was now looking at the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which was part of France, had been since 1648, and it was ethnically, about 50-50 ethnically French-German. Bismarck was, and the Prussians, from the minute they defeated the Austrians, began planning for this war. They had everything laid out, railroad timetables for the movement of troops and weapons and supplies. They had the technology in place. On the other hand, he was essentially trying to provoke Napoleon III to fight exactly the kind of war that Bismarck says he should never fight, a war fought out of anger, a war fought out of sense of pride or revenge. And Napoleon bit, and France declared war. This became known as the Franco-Prussian War. And predictably, the Prussians stormed into France, crushed French forces at the Battle of Sedan, Sedan, a battle at which Napoleon III actually was taken prisoner. And although the city of Paris itself held out for a couple more months, forcing the Prussians to besiege the city, and they did in fact besiege and bombard Paris, in the end, in 1871, the French had to accept defeat. And Napoleon took from them, Bismarck and Prussia took from them Alsace-Lorraine. And with that, the unification of Germany was completed. And the coronation of Wilhelm I as the first Kaiser of Germany, the first Kaiser of the Second German Reich. Reich means empire. The first German Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. This will be the Second German Reich. The coronation of Wilhelm as Kaiser, Emperor of the Second German Reich, was completed in 1871 at the Palace of Versailles. It so happens, too, that the unification of Italy was completed at this time in 1871 because the French troops who had been in the Papal States protecting it on behalf of the Pope had to be withdrawn in order to fight the Prussians at home. And with that, the Italians moved in. The Pope was deprived of his territory, removed as head of state, and with that, the Papal States were extinguished. They became absorbed into the new Italian state. Eventually, the Pope would get a small, tiny little state back in the Lateran Treaty signed with Mussolini in the 1920s, but from 1871 until 1923-24, the Pope was a spiritual leader only. He was no longer the ruler of any state of any kind. Now, Bismarck, having used warfare to build the German state, became the chief peacemaker in Europe. Because of Germany's position right in the center of Europe and because of its growing power, he feared that in the event of a general European war, Germany would be torn apart, forced to fight on 2 or even 3 fronts. And so he focused his diplomatic efforts on keeping the peace. And so, for example, when the scramble for Africa began, and Britain and France and Italy and Belgium and Portugal and Spain and all of the European countries were trying to carve up Africa and take for themselves as much as they could. It was Bismarck, first of all, who really restrained Germany and didn't push very hard for a lot of German possessions there, but more importantly called all of the European states to the Berlin Conference in 1885 to come up with an orderly approach to the division of Africa that would not result in a general war. And then again, when the Russians precipitously made war on the Ottoman Empire in 1877 and forced the Ottoman Empire to sign the Treaty of San Stefano, which would have given Russia control of the straits leading from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and would have really alarmed the British, and which made some states independent, some nations independent that Austria had its eye on. It was Bismarck who sort of brought them together again at Berlin, the Congress of Berlin, to renegotiate that treaty. So he was always working to try to ensure that the balance of power was maintained and that Germany was not perceived as aggressive or problematic, because he really believed that a general European war would be destructive to Germany, really. Within Germany, he was actually, although a conservative, engaged in some very progressive policies as Germany began to industrialize and experience the kind of industrial growing pains that Britain had. It was Bismarck who promoted the establishment of, for example, an old age pension to care for persons who had gained income, who in their whole lives made income from working in factories, could no longer do that in old age. He also established a sort of workers' compensation program for workers injured on the job. So in many ways, Bismarck was progressive and was a builder of peace, although for many people he has this, I think, undue reputation of being a warmonger. But he ran afoul of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Because Kaiser Wilhelm II then, young and very much determined to give Germany its place in the sun, didn't like the fact that Otto von Bismarck's foreign policy was restrained. Kaiser Wilhelm II promoted what he called Weltpolitik, world politics, the idea that Germany should play a large role in the world, a robust role. And making peace and keeping peace just wasn't what Wilhelm was thinking of. He wanted to build an empire, and whereas Bismarck was restraining Germany from building an empire. And so ultimately Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck, and he began doing the things that he believed in doing, like building up Germany's navy to challenge the British. Well, this took Britain and made rivals of the British. And then he entered into a strategic partnership with the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire to modernize the Ottoman Empire. Well, this made enemies out of the Russians, who were waiting for Turkey to finally collapse so they could get what they wanted, you know. And all these things, all these acts pushed Britain and Russia into alliance with France, which was irreconcilably against Germany anyway, because France wanted to retake Alsace-Lorraine, which they had lost to Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. So rather than finding ways to isolate France, instead Wilhelm, through his actions, ended up isolating Germany, and then began to complain of encirclement at the hands of the French and the British and the Russians. On the other hand, the Austrians, which had managed to, at the Congress of Berlin, receive the territory of Bosnia, which would have been part of a new independent Serbia under the original Russian Treaty of San Stefano, which they had made after defeating the Ottoman Turks. Austria had received the region of Bosnia, in which 1 million Serbs lived. And many of those Serbs wanted to detach themselves from Austria-Hungary and attach to the independent state of Serbia. And there was a lot of agitation there, and the establishment of a Serb nationalist terrorist organization called the Black Hand. They were the ones who were behind the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Gavrilo Princip was the assassin who killed off Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in June of 1914. And it was that event which triggered World War I, the Great War in Europe, because The Serbs had the support of Russia. Austria had forged an alliance known as the Triple Alliance with Germany. Austria went to Kaiser Wilhelm II and asked if, in the event of war with Russia, because Austria was looking to punish Serbia for its perceived role in the assassination, they knew that would probably lead to war with Russia. Austria sought from Wilhelm II the assurance that Germany would back up their ally Austria in the event of war with Russia, and Wilhelm gave them that assurance, and with that, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized against Austria and Germany, and then Germany declared war, and that was the beginning of World War I. Which brings us up to 1914, and we'll call that the end of this review session.